when I say open, I do mean that I'm open to anybody who sincerely would like to talk about this.
Alright, so about a month has passed since I made a video about Corey Olsen, Tolkien professor, stating that Tolkien himself never said that dwarves had beards. Might have been more than just a month ago at this point. But that raised a few eyebrows, and in an effort to try and lower some of those back to more sustainable levels, he brought out a 2-hour video. Now, I watched through this to hear the context for his thoughts and any things that might have been missed in his video for IGN. Disclaimer, I really like Corey Olsen for his work, and I would have found it very difficult to believe some of the things that he said in that interview without there being significant context. Now, he lets us know that for the making of that video, he had a chat which lasted over 3 hours, and that was condensed to a mere 15 minutes. To begin, Corey mentions Tolkien's letter 131, and he says to the recipient that they should not expect the tales of Middle-earth to be anything like the Eastern or Greco-Roman classical tales. It's going to be completely different, and of course that was the base at which, that is all that was known at the time. It was going to be heavily inspired by Germanic or North European mythologies. So why we bring this up? Well, Corey talks about here about just how much Tolkien borrowed his stories from these cultures that he was seeking to emulate. See, he was trying to construct a mythos for England, but to do it from scratch, that would be far more difficult. And as a Finn myself, I feel privileged that Tolkien took such a liking to our national epic, Kalevala, that he straight up ripped his story of Turin Turambar from the tale of Kullervo, right down even to the talking sword, which also inspired Shakespeare's Hamlet, which I did not know. So yes, even Shaky was unoriginal. Corey argues that creative engagement is always the winner, and this is key in any adaptation. This isn't limited to making films or video series of a book. It could be music or visual art of some kind that expresses an interpretation of the original work, like a YouTube video. So let's tie this into the Rings of Power, the Amazon show, the thing that we are most keenly interested in. The Second Age of Middle-earth, in comparison to the First and Third Ages, is a big sketch of a great tale. You have a recovery for the elves, the forging of the rings, and then the near collapse of Elvendom before the mighty Númenóreans come back into the picture, rising to become a great expansionist nation, forging stronger ties with the elves of Lindon, and then the shadow falls on Númenor and it is sunk, and you have the War of the Last Alliance to round it out. In terms of story, that's everything we know, but it is a stark contrast to, how much even more complete the first stage is. And well, Corey made a point that really resonated with me. And the internet encourages us to be dismissive with things that we don't immediately like.
That is not a place for rounded and thoughtful discourse. It's just generally not. So let's have here a calm and open discussion.
So when you have limited characters to reply in a tweet, YouTube comment, or buzzing live stream, you have to be concise and not always coherent, PogChamp. And it's ironic, really, that far more people have engaged with the 15-minute IGN video than his 2-hour video follow-up to address it. Now, I am guilty of the same thing 100%, but this is not an admission of being wholly wrong, nor of letting go of the gripes that I may have with the Rings of Power. I would encourage being self-aware of these things, though. But with this in mind, the Lord of the Rings films by Peter Jackson were adaptations too. Now, they provided a wonderful soundtrack, fantastic depictions of landmarks of Middle-earth, and a greater awareness of proper meal times. That said, they are not the gospel of Tolkien either. You know it, I know it, everyone knows it. There is evidence, though, that we still cling on to it a little bit too hard for fear of these images that I just explained to be ruined. So how can this fear be alleviated? Let's consider that the truly great stories don't have an ending. Now, Corey mentioned the Greco-Roman classics of the Aeneid and Iliad, which have had several films made of, but also the Legends of King Arthur and his Round Table, which also have many adaptations. It is a big deal to be compared with these great works, but it also raises the point that I think really matters. The original story of the sack of Troy can still be accessed, and by watching Brad Pitt's peak athletic figure cleave helmets with a letter opener, doesn't mean that the original tale is altered in any way, nor does it mean that you actually have to interact with this adaptation. An adaptation can eventually lead to engagement with the original material. Who watched the Lord of the Rings films and then read the book? You then may have read The Hobbit too and gone further still. You find all those differences like, oh hey, Glorfindel seems pretty powerful. Why didn't he come up in the film? Why didn't he join the Fellowship, for example? And that is good, and yet we can still enjoy the films and the books, and even some games as separate entities. Now, each adaptation has to make a judgment call as to how they want to do it. Translating a book into live action, it requires choices to be made, just as Tolkien made when translating Kalevala from Finnish to English, or indeed if you read Lord of the Rings in any other language other than English, because adapting a book into live action is just like translating it into another language too. Corey says that he believes that, judging by the comments that he's received on his social media, is that folk under the age of 35 are more worried about this than those over 35. The people that knew Lord of the Rings prior to Jackson's nigh perfect movie adaptation that released between 2001 to 2003. And these are also the ones that are reacting less adversely to the news that has come out thus far. And the example he uses is the Hobbit films. So I read the book before seeing the film, whereas I saw the Lord of the Rings films before reading those books. Corey feels that the legacy of the Hobbit is still intact despite the film adaptations, which are pretty much universally panned at this point, for not only being bad adaptations, but just being slightly like off films. Similarly, if you go back and take a look at the Ralph Bakshi adaptation from the 70s, that is just visually horrendous by modern standards, obviously. The bottom line in Corey's mind is that it is going to be fine.
And that is an encouraging thought.
The fear of a bad adaptation is thanks to recent films like those that were recently added to the Star Wars saga and films like that. The new episodes got a bad reception due to them being poor films for their storytelling. Now, the Star Wars prequels, 1, 2, and 3, they came out about 20 years ago at this point, and they were similarly panned, although it's kind of nice to see Anakin's very rapid descent and how it leads to the original trilogy. That's just me. But Corey even mentions that his wife refuses to let anyone even speak of anything but the original Star Wars trilogy because it pains her.
My wife loves the Star Wars trilogy and absolutely refuses to even let the prequel series be discussed in her presence because she doesn't want to lose her love of the original trilogy.
This does mean that for people that have had enough of engagement with any more adaptations of Tolkien's work, can always just have the Jackson trilogy as the holy grail to partner with the books. I think that you can engage with the new series without having to invest in it, if that makes sense. If there's something you disagree with, you can move on from it. Take the example of Arwen taking Glorfindel's spot in the Fellowship, finding Strider and the Hobbits in the wild. Yeah, we understand now that it was a choice of the production to make that change, and the reason makes sense for a 3-hour film. And that leads to the final point of Corey's that he has aptly named the Jacksonian knee-jerk effect. And that is that short-haired elves were never mentioned, for example, by Tolkien, to not exist. We, myself included, have a vision of elves provided by Jackson's films. However, he cautions us here to stop and think. Are these Tolkien's elves or Jackson's?
This is one of the main reasons why I'm looking forward to the Amazon show. Because there are so many ways in which I think it's going to be a helpful corrective to force you to say, okay, wait, hang on a second. Is that Tolkien or is that me? Is that Peter Jackson, right?
Once you question a few subjects of the films, you realize that there is a lot of bias that we can learn to separate from what Tolkien actually said and what we have got familiar and comfortable with. And I think this is exactly what IGN took out of context from Corey's interview. The Balrog was never as big as he was shown in the film, but he did look pretty badass. But he also didn't have wings. If we can go in with an open-minded approach, then we can judge the adaptation on its merits for what it is. It is not a replacement of what has and always will be, even if it is a story poorly told by people who think that they can write equally as well as Tolkien. There will be good aspects of it that we might enjoy. And those items we can then pick out and put into our little basket of accepted Tolkien adaptive works. That means that different people will have different baskets, just like Corey Olsen's own household is split in on the Star Wars issue. But it does not affect how we can still interact with the base material, like the books, which, everything has evolved from, and, that is my optimistic outlook. To clear Corey Olsen's name and revoke perhaps some of the scathing remarks that I made in the last video. The interview did last for 3 hours, and he had to look at Lord of the Rings at surface level for a casual viewer of pretty much only the films, right? So for this reason, there is only Aragorn's joke and Gimli's explanation of dwarves or dwarvish women in the Two Towers. That's all that is ever spoken about dwarf women for this example.
It's true you don't see many dwarf women. And in fact, they are so alike in voice and appearance that they're often mistaken for dwarf men. It's the beards.
Either way, it's an adaptation's choice. And fear of the unknown perpetuates the question, like, what if they ruin Lord of the Rings, but they won't, at least according to Corey? The Hobbit films have not changed like how we can interact with the book. You can still pick it up and it's exactly the same. And it won't be changed by any artist's interpretation. You can make of it what you will yourself. The other fear is that what if the adaptation replaces the stories in the books? And I would say I'm also guilty of fearing this. But again, actually, this can't happen either because, the big bonus that is to come from diversions from the status quo, as it were, is that we can delve into the lore further and seek out the pros and cons for different decisions that were made at each crossroad in the adaptation. So have you ever noticed just how many videos there are on YouTube or anywhere else about the real battle of the Pelennor Fields, what really happened at Helm's Deep? Or even who is Tom Bombadil? These questions are raised because they either changed from the original text in the adaptation, or they were completely omitted. Sorry, Tom. The people that are interested, they're going to go and look for those answers, and it will ultimately get them into the books, or they will become one of us, basically. And that is a good thing. And I agree with Mr. Olsen on that point too. And I can attest to that fact because I myself was one of those people. I was bought the Fellowship of the Ring VHS for my birthday many moons ago. Actually, where is it? I probably got it here somewhere. Crikey. Bet you didn't even know these things existed. Woo. And then I really got into Lord of the Rings. Watched the films in the cinema when they came out, after the first one anyway. But I had also started to read the books and then read the Silmarillion by the age of 11. Although admittedly, I didn't really appreciate the Silmarillion until I read it again when I was like 16 or so. But based on how popular the previous video was, I wanted to clear up some of those thoughts from Mr. Olsen. And also, it's never too late to change your mind. Don't be too stubborn that when new evidence is brought forward that you can't think for yourself based on what's in front of you. You don't have to immediately hate or love anything. You can always just remain somewhere in between. We don't have to go to extremes on anything. That goes for anything, not just the Rings of Power. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you have a good day.